The 17th of April 1944. Camp Algona, Iowa, United States. The sound of the train's brakes was a long, exhausted sigh, marking the end of a journey that had begun in the chaos of a battlefield and stretched across an ocean. Inside the cramped, stale air of the cattle cars, men in the faded and torn uniforms of the Wehrmacht, the Afrika Korps, and the Luftwaffe stirred. They were veterans, their faces etched with the experiences of the frozen Eastern Front, the scorching North African desert, and the smoky skies over Europe. They had been prepared for this moment, not with hope, but with a grim resignation forged by their own government's propaganda. They expected barbed wire. Yes, but they also expected brutality, starvation rations, and the slow, dehumanizing erosion of their spirit. They were prepared for the worst manifestations of war, as they understood it. But as the heavy doors slid open, the reality that flooded into the dark carriages was not one of menace, but of bewildering order. The barbed wire was there, glinting in the sunday, the watchtowers stood sentinel, and armed American guards watched them with wary eyes. The scene fit the picture of a prison camp. Yet the atmosphere was wrong. There was no shouting, no violence. Instead, there was a quiet, procedural efficiency that was, in its own way, more disconcerting than the hatred they had anticipated. The first thing that truly began to dismantle their reality, however, wasn't a weapon or a threat. It was the promise of a hot shower. It was the distribution of small, unassuming cardboard boxes. It was the strict, non-negotiable rule that they must shave every single day. This is the story of a silent, profound front in the Second World War. A conflict fought not in the bombed-out cities of Europe or the coral atolls of the Pacific, but in the showers, latrines, and barracks of the American heartland. It is the story of a collision between two cultures, two philosophies of war, and two vastly different understandings of the value of a human life. This is the story of how American industrial abundance, codified into a strict regime of personal hygiene, became one of the most effective and unexpected psychological weapons of the conflict, leaving a permanent scar on the worldview of the German soldier. This is the story of the Clean War. To fully comprehend the seismic shock of this encounter, we must first journey back and meet the two main actors in this drama, the German Lanzer and the American GI. Their experiences, their training, and the very material realities of their military lives were not merely different, they were products of civilizations that had chosen profoundly different paths to war. The German soldier, the Lanzer, who stepped off that train in Iowa, was the end product of the Blitzkrieg. He was a masterpiece of tactical discipline, trained in a system that prized initiative at the junior officer level and unshakable obedience from the rank and file. His army had swept across Europe with stunning speed and efficiency. But the Blitzkrieg was a predator built for the kill, not for a long, drawn-out siege. Its logistical tale was lean, designed for short, victorious campaigns. As the war ground on into a brutal war of attrition on 2 and then 3 fronts, this logistical system began to falter, then to fracture. For the common German soldier, especially those who had served on the Eastern Front, the war had devolved into a primal struggle for survival that went far beyond combat with the Red Army. It was a war against the cold, against hunger, and against the relentless, microscopic enemies of filth and disease. Personal hygiene, in any sense that an American would recognize, had become an impossible luxury, a casualty of a supply line stretched to its breaking point. Consider the reality for a German infantryman in Russia during the winter of 1942–43. A shower was a fantasy. Water, when it could be found, was frozen solid. Melting it for drinking was a priority. Using it for washing was an unthinkable waste. A single gritty bar of industrial soap might have to last a man for months, used for washing his clothes, his body, and his mess kit, becoming a slimy, disintegrating testament to his declining conditions. Lice were not a minor nuisance. They were a constant, maddening plague. They infested the wool of his uniform, breeding in the seams, causing intense itching and spreading deadly diseases like typhus. Soldiers would spend what little downtime they had engaged in louse hunts, carefully picking the parasites from their clothing and crushing them between their thumbnails, a futile and demoralizing battle against an enemy they could never fully defeat. Dental care was virtually non-existent. A toothbrush was a personal item that was easily lost or worn down to a nub. Toothpaste was a mythical luxury. Many soldiers resorted to using salt or nothing at all. Dental problems, when they arose, were agonizing, and field dentistry was a brutal, primitive affair, often performed without adequate anesthesia. The sound of a tooth being pulled with crude pliers was just another horror in a landscape of suffering. And then there was shaving. A daily shave was often an order, a way for commanders to maintain a facade of discipline and morale amidst the chaos, but it was a Spartan, punishing ritual. A soldier would use a straight razor or a safety razor with a dry shaving brush and a small, hard cake of soap. He would work for minutes, with a few precious drops of water, to work up a thin, weak lather that provided little protection. The shave was often raw, leaving the skin scraped and irritated. It was a functional, uncomfortable process, devoid of any pleasure or comfort. For the German Lanza, the body was a tool of the state, and its maintenance was strictly utilitarian. Cleanliness was not about self-esteem or comfort. It was a desperate, front-line defense against the environment and disease, a battle they were often losing. This was the hardened, resource-scarce mindset that was transported across the Atlantic. Now, let us turn our gaze to the American GI. He was the product of a different universe, a different way of waging war. The United States did not just have an army, it had a system, a vast, impersonal, and breathtakingly efficient industrial, military machine designed to project and sustain power on a global scale. This machine was fueled by the untouched industrial might of the American homeland and an agricultural sector that seemed to possess boundless fertility. The American military philosophy was deeply influenced by the hard-won lessons of history, particularly the sanitary disasters of the American Civil War and the trenches of World War I. The U.S. Army's medical department operated on a fundamental, data-driven truth. In modern warfare, disease historically incapacitates and kills more soldiers than enemy bullets and shells. Therefore, the health of the individual soldier was not a secondary concern for the medics. It was a primary strategic objective for the entire command structure. A sick army is a defeated army. This philosophy was not abstract. It was codified in field manuals and drilled into the bone of every recruit from his first day at basic training. Cleanliness was not a suggestion. It was a non-negotiable order, as vital to military effectiveness as marksmanship or drill. This created a culture of hygiene that was alien to the German experience. The physical embodiment of this culture was the standard-issue hygiene kit. Unlike the German Times Waschzeug **, which was often a personal or minimally supplied item, the American kit was a marvel of standardization and mass production. It was not a luxury. It was considered essential equipment, as important as a helmet or a rifle. When you were issued your uniform, you were issued your hygiene kit. Let's open one. Inside a sturdy cardboard box, a soldier would find a suite of products that represented the pinnacle of American consumer goods and packaging technology. There was a durable celluloid toothbrush with sturdy nylon bristles. There was a tube of toothpaste, typically from a familiar brand like Colgate or Pepsodent. This was not a powder. It was a smooth, sweet, minty-flavored paste housed in a flexible, collapsible metal tube. Then there was the razor, most often the ubiquitous and reliable Gillette Tech Safety Razor. But the true centerpiece, the item that would most captivate and confuse the German POW, was the aerosol can of shaving cream. Imagine this object through the eyes of our German Lanza. The aerosol can was a piece of technology that bordered on magic. It was a product of American industrial chemistry and engineering, perfected in the late 1930 seconds. There was no brush, no cake of soap, no need to work up a lather. You simply pressed the nozzle, and with a satisfying, hissing release of propellant, a perfect, white, voluminous mountain of rich, pre-made lather erupted into your palm. It was cool, it was thick, and it was incredibly effective. The sheer convenience of it, the sheer technological overkill for the simple act of shaving, was staggering. Completing the kit was a large, opaque bar of strong disinfectant soap, designed to lather profusely even in cold, hard water, a towel, and a comb. Every item was designed for durability, effectiveness, and crucially, for replacement. When your tube of toothpaste ran out, you got another one. When the soap bar dwindled, it was swapped for a new one. This was not a matter of individual thrift. It was a matter of systemic supply. This kit was backed by an unyielding, robotic consistency of routine. A GI was expected to shave every day. This order was enforced even on the front lines. An unshaven soldier could be denied leave or assigned extra duty. Showers, whether in permanent barracks or from mobile laundry and bath units that followed the troops, were a regular requirement. Latrines, or shitters, were dug according to a precise sanitary code, always downwind and a specific distance from company streets and field kitchens. These kitchens themselves were subject to strict white-glove hygiene inspections. The US Army was, in a very real sense, the cleanest, most medically conscious fighting force in human history. But this focus on hygiene was about more than just preventing typhoid and dysentery. It was about morale. The American military understood the psychology of the soldier. A clean shave, a hot shower, and a fresh set of clothes could restore a man's sense of self-respect and normalcy amidst the terror, gore, and filth of combat. It was a ritual that reaffirmed his humanity. A soldier who felt cared for by the system was a soldier who would fight better and endure more. This entire culture, the kits, the routines, the endless logistical pipeline was about to be applied, not to its own citizens, but to its enemies. And the effect would be nothing short of revolutionary. The journey that brought these two worlds into collision was itself a profound psychological experience for the German POW. For those captured in North Africa in 1943, the process began with a long sea voyage, often crammed into the holds of Liberty ships, their destination a mystery. Many feared they were being taken to Britain or Canada, where they believed conditions would be harsh. The first glimpse of the United States was, for many, a sight that defied belief. The skyline of New York City, untouched and soaring, or the vast, placid harbor of Boston, was a visual shock. Here was a nation that showed no physical scars of war. The bridges were intact, the traffic flowed, the civilians looked well-fed and prosperous. It was a silent, powerful testament to a war economy operating safely beyond the reach of enemy bombers, a reality that directly contradicted the narrative of a struggling, decadent democracy they had been fed. The train journey inland to camps in the Midwest was a further lesson in American scale and wealth. They looked out from their barred windows onto a landscape of almost mythical abundance. Endless fields of wheat and corn stretched to the horizon. Herds of fat cattle grazed in pastures. The towns they passed through were clean, orderly, and showed no signs of rationing or deprivation. For men who had lived under the strict rationing of the German home front for years, this visual proof of American economic power was deeply demoralizing. It suggested a war effort that was not straining its resources, but one that was operating with an immense, almost casual surplus. The sheer continental vastness of the country was overwhelming. They traveled for days, and the prosperity never seemed to end. They were being swallowed by a nation whose true strength they had profoundly underestimated. This was the backdrop against which the specific drama of the camp processing would unfold. The Germans arrived not just as prisoners, but as men whose entire framework of reality had already been severely shaken. They were prepared for the worst, but the universe they had entered seemed to operate by a different, more generous set of physical and moral laws. The stage was set for the final, and most intimate, shock. The processing of the new prisoners was a carefully orchestrated ritual, designed by the US Army to be efficient, sanitary, and secure. For the new arrivals, it was a step-by-step dismantling of their expectations. They were lined up, not with brutality, but with a firm, procedural authority. The first command, delivered through interpreters, was to strip completely. For a proud German soldier, steeped in a culture of uniform and discipline, this was a moment of profound vulnerability and humiliation. To stand naked before his captors was to be stripped of his identity, his rank, his very dignity. They complied slowly, steeling themselves for the cold hose down, the rough, invasive delousing with harsh chemicals, the physical abuse they believed was their due. but the abuse did not come. Instead, they were marched, often in their naked state, into a shower facility. And then came the second, deeper shock, one that was both physical and psychological. The water was hot. Not lukewarm, but genuinely, steamingly hot. For men who had known only the sting of cold water in makeshift desert showers, or who had broken ice to wash their faces in Russia. The sensation was almost overwhelmingly pleasurable. It was a physical comfort many had not felt in years. This was not a rushed, functional delousing. It was a thorough, cleansing baptism. They were given bars of that strong, pungent American soap that produced a rich, copious lather. The act of washing away the grime of the long journey, of feeling the hot water on their skin, was transformative. It was a silent, powerful message from their captors, more eloquent than any speech. Asterisk. Your basic humanity will be respected here. Asterisk. After drying off with clean, rough-textured towels, they were issued new clothes. Not the tattered field grey uniforms they had arrived in, but new, sturdy, olive-drab uniforms, each piece prominently stamped with the letters PW in large white paint. The fabric was thick, the stitching strong. The quality, to their surprise, was often better than the uniforms they had worn in the field. They were being reclothed, re-identified, and brought into a new system. But the true, mind-bending surprise, the moment that most clearly symbolized the chasm between their old world and their new one, was the distribution of the small cardboard boxes. Each man was handed one. Let's freeze this moment and examine it through the eyes of a specific, though hypothetical, prisoner. Let's call him Unteroffizier Erich Vogel, a 8-year-old from Dresden who had been a machine gunner in the 6th Army, survived the encirclement at Stalingrad, and was later captured in Italy. He is weary, cynical, and expects to be exploited and mistreated. He opens the box. First, he pulls out the toothbrush. It's standard, but it's new and unworn. Then, his fingers close around the tube of toothpaste. He examines the flexible metal tube. He is familiar with tooth powder in paper packets, but this is different. He unscrews the cap and sniffs tentatively. A blast of cool, minty freshness fills his nostrils. The flavor is clean, sweet, and utterly alien to him. It isn't just functional, it's pleasurable, a small sensory luxury that belonged to a civilian world he had almost forgotten. Then his hand finds the most perplexing object in the box, the aerosol can of shaving cream. He turns it over in his hands. It is heavy, cold, and enigmatic. He has no frame of reference for what it could be. Around him, he hears the murmurs of his comrades, their speculation ranging from the practical to the absurd. Is it a new kind of food concentrate? A metal polish? A type of explosive? Finally, an interpreter explains, it is for shaving. Eric had spent his entire adult life shaving with a brush and a hard cake of soap, a process that took time and effort to produce a thin, unsatisfactory lather. He is skeptical. He tentatively presses the nozzle. With a sharp, satisfying times hiss asterisk, a perfect, white, voluminous mound of rich, thick lather erupts into his palm. The wastefulness of it, the sheer, unadulterated technological luxury. Why would any army, any nation, go to such extravagant, complex lengths for something as simple as shaving? In that moment, the can ceases to be a mere toiletry. It transforms into a potent, tangible symbol of American industrial genius and a bottomless economic power. It was a message held in the hand. Asterisk. We have mastered not only the art of war, but the science of comfort on a scale you cannot possibly fathom. Asterisk. The distribution of the kits was followed by a briefing from the camp commander or his adjutant. The rules were laid out with crystal clarity. They were expected to shave every single day. They were expected to brush their teeth. They were expected to keep their barracks impeccably clean, their bunks made tight enough to bounce a coin, their personal areas orderly, ready for daily inspections by American officers who would wear white gloves to check for dust. For Eric and his comrades, this created a profound and disorienting cognitive dissonance. They were the enemy. They were the vanquished, the prisoners. Yet, They were being treated with a level of material comfort and subjected to a regime of personal care that surpassed what many had known as free men in their own army. The very definition of their captivity was being rewritten before their eyes. It was not being framed as a punishment, but as a structured, almost paternalistic system that concerned itself with their individual well-being. This generated a deep confusion and, for the more perceptive like Eric, a creeping, unsettling sense of inferiority. The question began to form, quietly at first, then with more insistence. How could the Third Reich, which preached incessantly about its racial and cultural supremacy, fail to provide for its own soldiers what these so-called decadent and weak Americans gave freely to their prisoners? The foundations of everything they had been taught were being washed away, not with rhetoric, but with hot water and shaving cream. This was not, as it first appeared, a simple act of kindness or naivete on the part of the Americans. It was, in fact, a deliberate and brilliantly executed policy, a form of psychological warfare that was both subtle and devastatingly effective. American camp commanders, guided by the Geneva Convention and advised by intelligence officers from the Provost Marshal General's office, understood the principles of human morale intimately. They knew that a comfortable, healthy, and occupied prisoner is a manageable prisoner. He is less likely to orchestrate mass escapes, foment rebellion, or cling to a fanatical, last-ditch loyalty to a collapsing regime. A bored, mistreated, and desperate man is a security risk. A clean, well-fed man playing soccer, working in a field, or studying in a camp library is not. But the hygiene policy and the culture of abundance it represented went far beyond the pragmatic goals of camp management. It operated on several deeper, more profound psychological levels that struck at the very heart of the German prisoner's identity and belief system. First and foremost, it systematically and daily undermined Nazi propaganda. For years, Joseph Goebbels' powerful Ministry of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda had painted a very specific picture of the United States. It was a weak, degenerate, and racially muddled society, a nation of gangsters and jazz, incapable of the spiritual fortitude and disciplined sacrifice required for total war. The American soldier was portrayed as a lazy, gum-chewing individualist who could not stand up to the ideologically pure, hardened German warrior. The reality the POWs encountered was the absolute antithesis of this caricature. The Americans were not weak. They were logistically organized to an astonishing, almost inhuman degree. They were not undisciplined. Their camps ran with a clean, efficient, and impersonal precision that was, in its own way, more intimidating than the shouted discipline of the Wehrmacht. The shaving cream can, the hot shower, the perfectly ordered barracks, the endless supply of quality food, these were not symbols of decadence, but of an industrial and organizational power so vast it could afford to be generous. Every time a POW used that tube of toothpaste, every time he experienced the effortless luxury of the shaving cream, the propaganda lies he had internalized for years were being eroded, little by little. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. The evidence of their own eyes and senses was proving their own government to be a liar. Second, it was a constant, silent, and deeply humiliating demonstration of American wealth and power. The sheer, overwhelming abundance of everything was a daily, unspoken lecture in economics and industrial might. The food was not just adequate, it was plentiful and high-quality white bread, real beef, corn, potatoes, coffee, and even, unbelievably, ice cream. The medical care was prompt, professional, and comprehensive. And the hygiene products were replaced without question when they ran out. This relentless abundance sent an unmistakable message. We are so economically powerful, so rich, that we can treat our enemies better than your own nation treats its heroes. For men who had endured the increasing privations of the German home front and the desperate shortages on the battlefield, this was a demoralizing realization. It hinted at a war that was lost not just on the battlefield through tactical errors, but in the factories and farms long before the first shot was fired. It suggested that Germany was not just fighting armies, but was pitted against the insurmountable force of the American economy itself. Third, and perhaps most profoundly, the strict, enforced hygiene rules were instrumental in humanizing the enemy, the shared daily rituals, the entire camp lining up at the washstands to shave each morning, the communal smell of the same soap, the shared, peculiar taste of the mint toothpaste created a strange communal normalcy. By following the American routine, the German POWs were unconsciously being integrated into a system that valued the individual's health and comfort. It is far harder to demonize and hate a captor who provides you with the means to feel clean, healthy, and human. The American guard who enforced the shaving rule was not a faceless, hate-filled brute. He was a young man from Iowa or Texas who followed the same rules, used the same soap, and probably complained about the same morning ritual. This forced a human connection, a recognition of shared experience that transcended national animosity. It compelled a slow, steady, and deeply unsettling re-evaluation of the very nature of their enemies. They weren't the monstrous caricatures of propaganda, they were just men from a very different, very abundant world, who operated on a principle of rules and, seemingly, fairness. Finally, from a ruthlessly practical and strategic standpoint, the policy worked flawlessly in promoting order and health. The rates of disease and mortality in American POW camps in the United States were astonishingly low, especially when compared to the horrific conditions in Japanese camps or the deliberate starvation and neglect in Soviet gulags. This was a direct result of the hygiene policy. A healthy prisoner was not a drain on scarce medical resources. Furthermore, under the Geneva Convention, a healthy prisoner could be made to work. Thousands of German POWs were employed in agricultural labor harvesting, wheat, picking peaches, cutting timber, helping to offset the critical labor shortage in the American home front caused by the draft. In this light, hygiene was not just good morals or good psychology. It was sound business and smart military strategy. It turned a potential liability hundreds of thousands of men to feed and guard into a productive asset that contributed directly to the Allied war economy. The impact of this hygiene shock did not end when the war ended in 1945, and the last POWs were repatriated to a broken and divided Germany. For the nearly 400,000 German soldiers who had been held in the United States, their captivity became a defining, almost surreal memory, a peaceful and prosperous interlude bizarrely sandwiched between the trauma of combat and the devastation of returning to a defeated, shattered homeland. In countless post-war memoirs, interviews, and letters, the same themes emerge with remarkable consistency. They speak of the fairness of the guards, the stunning, almost embarrassing abundance of food, and the bewildering yet ultimately comforting focus on cleanliness and order. One former lieutenant, who had fought in the bitter hedgerows of Normandy, recalled his first encounter with the hygiene kit in a memoir decades later. "We examined that can of shaving cream, like archaeologists with a strange artifact from a lost civilization. We could not understand its purpose. Was it a new kind of explosive? A food paste? When the interpreter finally explained, we were speechless. Such a complicated, ingenious solution for such a simple problem. It was in that moment, more than in any battle, that I began to understand that we had lost the war. We were not just defeated militarily, we were outclassed civilizatically. Our enemy was from the future. Another, a veteran of the Afrika Korps, who returned to the bombed-out ruins of Hamburg in 1947, wrote in his diary, a passage that has since become famous among historians, "My children are crying from hunger. My wife queues for hours for a single loaf of bread that is half sawdust. The city is a landscape of rubble and despair, a ghost of what it once was. And I close my eyes and am transported back to the camp in Nebraska. I can still smell the sharp, clean scent of that American soap. I can taste the mint of the toothpaste. There, behind the wire, we lived in a strange, peaceful abundance. Here, in our shattered freedom, we are starving. The world has been turned upside down, and the victors live by a different, more generous code than I ever knew existed. This personal, first-hand experience of American abundance and order had a profound and often overlooked effect on the post-war psyche of West Germany. The returning POWs became unintentional ambassadors for the American way of life. They had seen the decadence up close, and they had come to understand it not as weakness, but as a strength born from a functioning, prosperous, and surprisingly rule-based democratic society. They had witnessed a system that worked, that provided, and that upheld a standard of humanity even in victory. This direct exposure directly contributed to the Americanization of West Germany during the crucial early years of the Cold War. These men were the teachers, engineers, factory workers, and civil servants who would help rebuild their nation from the ashes. Their largely positive experiences in captivity helped to erode deep-seated anti-Western sentiment and paved the way for the acceptance of the Marshall Plan, for the integration of American cultural and political values, and for the strong transatlantic alliance that would define the latter half of the 20th century. The simple, daily acts of brushing teeth and lathering shaving cream had, in their own small, intimate way, planted a seed of a different future, a future of peace, stability, and material comfort that would, against all odds, blossom into the German Wirtschaftswunder, the economic miracle. The story that began on a spring day in Camp Algona is, in the grand, horrific scheme of World War II, a small story. It is a footnote in the vast, epic tragedy of the Holocaust, the Eastern Front, and the strategic bombing campaigns. It is overshadowed by the D-Days, the Stalingrads, and the Iwo Jimas. But history is not only written in the grand movements of armies and the earth-shattering decisions of dictators. It is also written in the small, quiet, human moments of dissonance and understanding. The gasp of surprise at a tube of toothpaste, the shared, bewildered laughter over a can of shaving cream, the quiet personal dignity found in a clean shave and a fresh shirt, the initial shock of processing the hot showers, the new uniforms, the bewildering hygiene kits had begun to settle into a strange new normal for the German prisoners of war. But this was only the prelude. As they moved from the transient processing centres into the main camps themselves, they entered a world that would systematically challenge every remaining assumption about their captors, their own government, and the very nature of modernity. The psychological offensive, waged with soap and rules, was now entering its main phase. Camp Algona, like hundreds of other purpose-built camps across the United States, was a study in orderly, almost sterile containment. It was not the squalid, overcrowded stalag of European imagination, born from desperation and neglect. It was a planned community, laid out with geometric precision on the Iowa prairie. Neat rows of wooden barracks, painted a drab but clean olive green, were separated by wide company streets. Each barrack was equipped with pot-bellied stoves for winter, screened windows for summer, and contained rows of iron-framed beds with real mattresses, not straw pallets. The air, particularly in the morning, carried the faint, clean scent of pine tar and disinfectant, not the pervasive odour of unwashed bodies and decay that characterized military life on the Eastern Front. The day began not with a barked command to stand for roll call in the freezing dark, but with the more mundane, yet equally non-negotiable, order to shave. The washhouses, long buildings with rows of sinks and mirrors, became the epicenter of the daily ritual. Here, each morning, the German soldier was confronted with the miracle of the aerosol can. The initial confusion had given way to a practiced routine. The hiss of a dozen cans being activated at once created a strange chorus. They would work the incredibly rich lather onto their faces, the minty scent of the shaving cream mixing with the carbolic smell of the soap from their showers. For many, this daily act became a quiet moment of reflection. The effortless luxury of it never fully lost its novelty. It stood in stark, silent contrast to the memory of shaving with a piece of broken mirror in a frozen dugout, using a few drops of precious water to work a thin lather from a disintegrating sliver of soap. The comparison was unavoidable, and it was deeply corrosive to the myth of German superiority. Following the shave and the morning roll call conducted with an efficiency that mirrored their own armies. But without the underlying threat of violence came breakfast, and here the psychological warfare of abundance escalated. The German prisoner, conditioned by years of shrinking rations in the Wehrmacht and at home, approached the mess hall with a mixture of skepticism and awe. What they received was not the watery soup and hard black bread they expected. The standard American Army ration for a POW was identical to that of a garrisoned GI. This meant eggs or oatmeal, white bread, real butter, jam, and coffee with sugar. For men whose palates had known only ersatz coffee made from roasted barley and bread stretched with potato flour, the taste of real coffee was a shock. The sheer whiteness of the bread, its soft texture, was a marvel. They called it cake. For dinner, there would be meat, not the stringy, occasional horse meat of the front, but beef, pork, or chicken, with potatoes, vegetables, and often a dessert like canned fruit, or, unbelievably, ice cream. The effect of this diet was profound and multifaceted. Physically, the prisoners began to gain weight and muscle. The hollow cheeks filled out, the pale complexions gained colour. But the psychological impact was even greater. The food was a constant, tangible reminder of American agricultural wealth. It was one thing to be told your enemy was rich. It was another to have that richness served to you on a tray, 3 times a day, every day. The Nazi narrative of a struggling, resource-poor America collapsed in the face of this relentless caloric surplus. A common saying began to circulate among the prisoners. "We are fatter and healthier in captivity than we ever were in freedom." This was not just a joke. It was a devastating indictment of the regime they had fought for. Beyond the barracks and the mess hall, the camps were designed to manage the prisoners' time, to prevent the idleness that could breed dissent and escape plots. The American solution was work and education. Under the Geneva Convention, enlisted men could be required to work, and they were, in vast numbers. They were contracted out to local farmers to harvest sugar beets, pick apples, and tend to crops. They worked in logging camps in the Pacific Northwest and in canneries and factories. This labor was crucial to the American war effort, filling the void left by millions of conscripted GIs. But for the prisoners, it was another window into American life. Working on a farm in Wisconsin or Minnesota, they saw the machinery of American agriculture firsthand. They saw the tractors, the combines, the level of mechanization that was simply unheard of on most German farms. They interacted with American farmers, who were often curious rather than hostile, and who sometimes shared meals with them, further humanizing the enemy. They saw the prosperity of the American countryside, the well-built farmhouses, the new trucks, the lack of visible poverty. This was not the impoverished, depression-ravaged nation of Nazi propaganda. It was a land of stunning, widespread plenty. The contrast with the war-ravaged, ration-card existence of their own families was painful and illuminating. For those not assigned to labor details, or during their off hours, the camps offered astonishing opportunities for self-improvement. This was perhaps the most unexpected front in the clean war. The U.S. Army, in cooperation with organizations like the YMCA, established extensive camp libraries and educational programs. Prisoners were encouraged to study. They formed orchestras and theater troupes. They built elaborate gardens and sports fields, where fiercely competitive soccer leagues sprang up. But the most significant intellectual development was the establishment of barbed wire universities. Prisoners, many of whom were highly educated engineers, academics, and professionals, organized formal classes for their comrades. They taught everything from foreign languages, especially English, to mathematics, history, and engineering. The Americans provided textbooks, paper, and pencils. This was not merely a way to pass the time. It was an intellectual reawakening. For many young soldiers who had been indoctrinated by the Nazi system and then thrust into the brutish reality of frontline combat, this was their first exposure to free, scholarly inquiry. They could read books that had been banned and burned in Germany. They could debate ideas without fear of the Gestapo. The camp library at places like Camp Grant in Illinois held thousands of volumes, and the prisoners devoured them. This intellectual freedom, coupled with the physical comfort, was completing the process of demystifying and humanizing the Western world that the Hygiene kit had begun. However, life in the camps was not a utopia, and the American system was not without its tensions and dark corners. A persistent and deeply troubling issue for the prisoners was the internal division between the majority of prisoners and the hardened, committed Nazis among them. These men, often the camp prominents appointed by the Americans to act as liaisons, maintained a ruthless control over the prisoner population. They enforced their own ideological purity, intimidating and sometimes violently assaulting those they deemed defeatists or traitors for being too friendly with the Americans or for questioning the Nazi cause. They viewed the American policy of fairness and abundance not as generosity, but as a weakness to be exploited and a poison to be resisted. They saw the focus on hygiene, education, and sports as a deliberate plot to soften them, to make them forget their duty to the fatherland. In several camps, like Camp Tonkawa in Oklahoma, these tensions boiled over into murder, with suspected anti-Nazis being beaten to death by their fellow prisoners. The American guards, often young and inexperienced, were sometimes slow to intervene in what they saw as internal German disputes. This shadow war within the wire was a grim reminder that the ideological battle was far from over, and that the clean war had its limits when faced with fanatical belief. Yet, for every committed Nazi, there were dozens of ordinary soldiers whose beliefs were being systematically dismantled by their daily experience. The evidence of their senses was overwhelming. They were clean, well-fed, healthy, and free to think. They were being treated according to a set of rules, the Geneva Convention, that their own government had signed but often ignored in its treatment of Soviet POWs. This respect for international law and procedure made a deep impression on men coming from a lawless, brutal dictatorship. It suggested a different way for a society to function, based on rules, not on the whims of powerful men. The relationship with the American guards evolved over time from one of mutual suspicion to one of, if not friendship, then often mutual respect and sometimes even camaraderie. The guards were not the brutal sadists of propaganda. They were, as one prisoner later wrote, mostly simple, decent boys from the farms and small towns of America. They shared their cigarettes, taught the prisoners slang English, and sometimes joined them in a game of soccer. The prisoners, in turn, saw that these young men missed their homes and feared being sent to the front lines just as they had. The human connection, fostered in an environment of basic decency, proved far more powerful than the abstract hatreds of wartime propaganda. As the war in Europe drew to a close in the spring of 1945, a new anxiety gripped the camps. News of the Holocaust and the full extent of Nazi atrocities began to filter in, often through American newsreels shown to the prisoners. For many, this was the final, horrifying piece of the puzzle. The regime they had served, whose propaganda they had once believed, was revealed to be not just militarily defeated, but morally monstrous. The clean, orderly world of the American camp stood in the starkest possible contrast to the images of the death camps. It created a profound crisis of conscience and a sense of collective shame that would haunt an entire generation. When the time for repatriation finally came, it was met with complex emotions. While there was a deep longing for home and family, many prisoners felt a genuine trepidation about returning to a Germany that was physically and morally destroyed. They were returning to a nation of rubble and hunger, a 0 hour. The memory of the American camps, the cleanliness, the order, the abundance became a golden memory, a benchmark for what life could and should be. The returning POWs did not come back as conquering heroes or even as a unified group. They returned as witnesses. They carried with them the memory of a different world, a practical demonstration of the prosperity and freedom that was possible under the American-led order. They became, often unconsciously, agents of change in post-war Germany. The engineers among them implemented American efficiency models in rebuilt factories. The teachers carried the spirit of the barbed wire university into their classrooms, emphasizing critical thinking over blind obedience. The ordinary workers and farmers had seen a standard of living that they now aspired to for themselves and their children. The clean war did not win the Battle of the Bulge or capture Berlin, but in its quiet, persistent way, it achieved a victory that would prove just as significant. By treating their prisoners with humanity, and by showcasing the fruits of a free, prosperous society, the Americans had planted a seed in the minds of hundreds of thousands of Germans. That seed would grow into the foundation of a new, democratic West Germany, a steadfast ally in the Cold War, and a testament to the idea that the most enduring conquests are not of territory, but of the human spirit. The war had ended with the unconditional surrender of the Nazi state, but the peace began with the conditional dignity granted to its soldiers in the showers and barracks of Camp Algona and hundreds of places like it. The legacy of the soap and the shaving cream would far outlast the memory of the gun and the grenade.